Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a nice week last week. Thanks to those of you that have put some of your work on the Facebook group. It's really nice to see how you're getting on with everything we've been doing, collage wise and paint wise and everything else. So thanks for doing that. What we're going to do today is we're going to start looking at some other artists' work. So I've got a video to show you on one of my favourite artists, Kurt Jackson, and his work is really experimental, so it kind of goes along with the theme that we've been doing. He's also a really good landscape painter as well. So we're going to have a look at a video on that. I'm going to be working from some of the artwork of Michael Morgan, who I've mentioned to you previously. His work is very experimental as well. He uses watercolours, but he also dabbles with acrylic paint as well, which is really nice. So we're going to have a look at that. And I'll show you what I've already done in the class last night as well, so you can get an idea of how we're tackling that. But it is a bit of mixed media and things as well. Okay, so I'll take you over to the wall and we'll have a look at what I've got on there. So this is what I've got on here. So the painting over this side, this one, is the Michael Morgan painting. The interesting thing about his work is that he actually creates these landscapes from his imagination. Now I suspect that he also draws from a photograph or some collected material, because he's often got these lovely little white buildings and things in there. And then a lot of the rest of it becomes quite abstract. And one of the things I noticed last night looking at it was that whereas the buildings are from the side on this hilltop here, the fields are almost like we're looking directly from above, or it's a very steep hill. So he's changing the perspective a little bit, but also he's layering lots of different colors on top of each other. And one of the nice things I like about this particular picture is the really strong orangey sort of yellow sky against the lovely blue just below it, but then also how he often picks out these buildings by having a very nice contrasting backdrop. So we've got the blue mountains, which have got this lovely dark area behind it, and then the really almost stark white buildings with the light coming in from the left hand side. And I've moved down this area towards the bottom now. You'll be able to see that in a few minutes, but I've started painting just down the bottom here. I'm layering colour. So I started with a wash of colour underneath in acrylics, and then what I'm doing is I've collaged back on top of that with some of the collage papers and things, but I'll show you that in a few seconds. So Kurt Jackson is an artist based down in Cornwall. So I'll just bring that to the top so we can see that. Oh, it's disappeared now. What's happened to that? Can't see it. Oh, there, it's gone down to the bottom. There we go. Right, so Kurt Jackson is this artist just here, and he's very experimental, and I've got a video on him actually to show you. And what he does is he uses all sorts of different materials, and he likes to have this idea of the experience of the landscape, a reason for painting the landscape. And he loves challenging himself by putting himself in unusual situations, like being on the edge of a cliff doing his paintings, because he sees it as an opportunity for chance mistakes or accidents to happen that actually then contribute to how the painting looks. So he enjoys the weather quite a lot. He paints with different materials, he collages different things in there. But anyway, I've got a video to show you on him, so you can get an idea of how he actually works and what his ideas are as well. So I'm going to play that for you now.
I believe I'm Kurt Jackson. I've always painted, I've always drawn, I've always done stuff like that. But combining that with my sort of respect and love for the natural world has meant that I've got this enthusiasm for creating something that is a response to the natural world, and how we fit into it, how we are changing it, how we're affecting it, how nature, the natural world, affects us. My real problem is to choose what not to paint, because basically everything out there is paintable, but I need more than that. I need a reason to paint it. It's rare that the projects just come out of nowhere. Normally they're ideas that have been in the back of my mind, an idea that's been building up for a little while. I refuse to have one way of working. The way I work is a combination of working on plein air and working in the studio. It can start in the studio and then go outside. It can start outside and follow up with work in the studio. The work outside is obviously a very direct result of contact with nature or with my environment. Using my hands, using my feet, using different brushes, palette knives, chucking it on, scraping it off, putting it on again, pouring it on, washing it off. The elements are affecting me directly. The salt water, the mud, the vegetation, the insects, it all gets somehow combined into what I'm doing. Eventually getting to a situation, either the weather's changing, the tide's moved on, but anyway, reaching a stage where I can't work it anymore, taking it home, back to the studio. Sometimes though, I'll start in the studio with an idea, because there's nothing worse than starting with white surface, so I'll build up some layers and work, prepare it in a way, then take it out, laying down collage onto a big unstretched piece of canvas, pouring on ink, acrylic, sometimes shellac, sometimes varnish, letting that dry, putting some more on, letting it dry, eventually getting to a state where the canvas is largely hidden and there's a resemblance, then getting out into the place I'd planned to work, unrolling that piece of canvas with that sort of preparation on it already and getting stuck in and see what happens. But working outside is far less controllable, so there's a lot more accidents, a lot more spontaneity. Exciting things tend to happen, especially if you put yourself in stupid places like on the edge of the cliff, on a rusty roof that might fall through. If you put yourself in a crazy place on a ship out in the ocean, then you're at the mercy of the elements or at the mercy of something else besides what's on inside your head and your hands. And so more exciting things tend to happen. I want a big range, sort of an eclectic sort of mess of different mark making. I'm using layers of different media and I'm mixing different media together. So whether we're talking acrylics, inks, varnishes, crayons, pastels, oil paint, and within each painting that's going to be a different proportion of one medium to another. So there's always a variety within a body of work. But eventually trying to reach that point where basically I can't think of anything else to do to it, I can't change it in any way. And then I'm trying to find that point where I put the final full stop, the punctuation, that's it. Ding, I've done it. I want to make exciting discoveries within each painting so that the next painting, I've moved on. There's always a sort of evolution of technique and result. If you've been working on something very big, then I might want to work on something very small, or if I've been working in one type of paint, then I might want to work in another type. By keeping that sort of diversity and variety going, I don't find I ever become stuck.
Wonderful. So I just in awe of that artist really, because the way he works outside all the time, and I love the way he was using lots of different materials, and then it was putting sand on the painting as well. So it kind of opens your mind a little bit listening and watching an artist like that produce their work. So I hope you enjoyed that, and perhaps we'll be working a bit more from some of his work. But if you've not heard of him before, Kurt Jackson, then have a look on the internet, because there are loads of paintings. He's very prolific, produces a lot of work, but it's that idea of just trying things out and seeing what happens, putting yourself in a different situation as well, that's really inspiring to see and to watch too. So we'll go and have a look at the work that I'm doing at the moment. So last time in the lesson I was working on this piece. So what I did first of all, as you remember, is I created the surface on which to paint. So I did that reasonably loosely, but on some areas I used the ripped wallpaper, which I PVA'd down. I've used lots of tissue to create the texture and the surface as well that I painted on. And then I used gouache back over the top and did lots of splattering with my toothbrush and so forth. So a really enjoyable piece of work, but layering lots of different techniques on top of each other, scraping some areas out again, and while the paint was wet, scraping into it as well. But the nice thing about gouache, of course, that we learned is that you can bring gouache back to life, whereas with acrylics, once it's dry, it's kind of much more permanent and things. So we did those ones as well. So we used mats and all sorts of things like that. So the piece of work that I've been working on was this one. And this is the one that I was just talking about a few minutes ago. So I started this last night, and in order to start it off, what I did is I folded the paper into quarters like this, so that then I could draw roughly. I didn't really measure this out, I just drew it almost like freehand, but I just worked out reasonably the same sort of proportions as the paper, and then drew the sections of the buildings in. I worked out where the different planes are going to be. So I worked out where the top of the mountain range is, about where the buildings are going to go. And then I just divided it again into these different sections. So I always start with the largest areas first of all, and then start working on the smaller bits. And folding the paper is obviously a really good way to then look in detail at those small areas when you start working on those. So I've not drawn everything in. In fact, I did just indicate where the trees are going to go. But other than that, I sketched it out quite lightly, because what I was going to do, and what I did in fact, was I used some lighter washes of colour and a flat brush, so something like this, and a watered down acrylic to then put the paint over the whole of the surface. So I did this turquoisey blue down here, I did another blue up here, I think it was a mixture of cobalt and ultramarine up here, and then I mixed an orangey sort of yellow. So I created those areas of colour before then working into it. So even on the areas where the buildings are, I put down some turquoise colour, because the idea being with these paints is that, you know, once it's dry, it's dry. It's not like the gouache, it won't kind of come back to life again. But what you do then is you can add the colour over the top, and you'll get some of that turquoisey blue coming through, and it kind of adds to the overall feeling in the picture. And I've also used a toothbrush as well. I've just lost that, I had it a minute ago. Anyway, I used my toothbrush to do a little bit of splattering here. And the other thing, and I did mention this in the email, is to perhaps bring along some colour pencils if you've got any, because what I'm doing as well over in the mountain area is I've started using some colour pencils on top as well. And while the paint is wet, which I mentioned with regard to the other picture, while the paint is wet, you can use the back of your brush to scratch, and you'll get some of the colour underneath coming back through. Largely though, to mix and blend the colour, what I've done is I've used a little bit of water with the paint that I put on the surface, and while it's wet, diluted it to spread it out and make it blend with any other colours that I've got, or even indeed the background colour that's dried up. All right, so what I'm doing now is I'm working on, mostly I'll be probably dotting around, but I'm working on the bottom area here with this, and I put on last night some scrunched up tissue paper and some textured paper. You'll see on the field in the photo, or the artwork I should say, you can see here that there's these fields that I mentioned earlier which look quite abstract. So I've decided to use some collage paper to represent those kind of bumps in there, and I'm going to paint over those and then scratch into them and draw lines into them and so forth. But I'll you know, I'll talk a little bit more about the techniques as I'm using them. So if you're ready to try and do a copy of an artist's work, the thing to do, what I've done is I've put a selection of artist work on the website for you to look at. If you click on one of those pictures, you'll see the name of the artist underneath. So you can either use that picture by right-clicking, saving it and printing it, or right-clicking and printing, or have a look for some other examples from those artists if you like them. And then we'll work in this way this week, creating a background wash first of colours that go with the picture, and then building on top. But I'm very much bringing in some of my own ideas into the picture as well, as you can see with the collage paper. So Michael Morgan does do a lot of experimenting. He'll use, I think, looking at the picture, he uses things like the modelling paste that I've used previously to create a background to put his washes of colour and things over, because it creates this nice texture. So he does do quite a lot of experimenting, but without picking all of this picture apart, I'm going to actually be a bit creative myself and start bringing in some ideas. So a little bit like Kurt Jackson, bringing in some different materials and just seeing how they interact and work together. So I'll be doing that today.
Right, so this is the night before. Just to take you back to what I was doing with the painting before that little talk just there, introducing the lesson. So to start with, what I decided to do after I'd drawn it out, and I did use kind of a grid for that, although I only divided it into 4 equal parts, so I could just work out where things are going to go quite quickly and easily. Here I'm doing some very light kinds of washes of colour, just to set the scene and get things started. So we've got this lovely orangey yellow in the sky, followed by the blue on the mountains, and then down below there's quite a lot of this kind of turquoisey colour down there as well. So I'm just I put that in, and the next thing I believe I do is I start working into the area near the houses and stuff, but I'm just getting out a few different colours on here. Now the colours I'm using are the acrylic Dahler and Rowney student set, which is has 48 wonderful colours that you can use. You can buy them in smaller amounts, yeah, so I've used a few different colours there to help me with this. I also used sort of some turquoisey colours that came with the set, some browns and things. I can't remember all the names of the colours, but you can work that out as you go along when you're painting. I've got a more of a pinky red, or I think it was a scarlety sort of colour up there on the sky there, on the around the mountain, and then some more yellowy browns. Now the technique I'm using here on top of my blue background is I'm almost using the paint a little bit like watercolour. I'm trying to add in all of the dark tones into the background to make the shape or the silhouette of those buildings sharp. And this is where a student had missed the opportunity to have a quick look at this book from Michael Morgan as well that I have. So I'll just show a few more examples. You can find loads of them on the internet if you're interested in having a look. Yes, as I said, I'm using the paint a lot like watercolor. So I'm putting a bit of paint down, adding some water to dilute it, and then perhaps adding another color next to it, so those colors end up bleeding into each other. It might have been nice to use some watercolor paper, as it's a bit thicker, and you get these nice grainy effects if you use the right watercolor paper, but it doesn't matter too much really. I'm still able to do quite a lot with this. So now we've got some contrast in the background of the mountain, and it shows up the buildings. I'm starting to look at the highlighted areas where the light hits the sides of the buildings from the left. I'm adding in some of those nice highlights into the buildings, and you can see things start to appear quite quickly actually. And I added a bit of blue into the grey on that side of the building. Here I'm using more of a dry brush technique, so that's not so much like a wash where you add lots of water. This is adding just the paint itself, the white paint with a bit of the yellow, orangey yellow that I mixed before, and perhaps a bit more yellow to brighten that up. So the dry brush allows you to get these brush strokey kind of marks, or hairy sort of marks, I guess. But I'm painting them in a direction that goes diagonally down towards the left. Again, we looked at this previously when we did drawing, so that technique has come back into use. So looking at the rest of the picture, there's lots of white appearing on there, so I've started applying more areas of white into that. See me picking them in. I'm using a small round brush to do this detail, and at the top I was using a larger flat brush to do the sky. So here I wanted to create this terracotta sort of colour on the roof, but I didn't want the colour to be overtly strong, so I mixed in a little bit of white, and then I've used a very small round brush to add in these little windows. Again, you don't have to use just pure Payne's grey, which is what I'm using here. I added some other colours in there, especially a touch of white to make it kind of just faded a little bit, so that the windows don't look too obvious that I painted those in, and they look more part of the ground. So I'm thinking about how the overall colour scheme when I add details, even though they might look quite dark, you need to lighten them up a bit to go with the rest of the buildings. Bearing in mind we've got lots of white buildings in this one. So I'm just refining and adding detail. One of the effective things I found with this painting actually is using my fingers to make colours blend into each other a little bit. So I just use my finger and brush the edges. It means it kind of it's a bit looser, it's not so precise and careful, which actually I think adds something to the picture. You can see me doing it quite a lot in this video, in this painting, just using my finger to move the paint around a little bit more. I'm also using the back of my brush. On the left there of the picture, I used the back of my brush to create some scraping marks going up the mountain to give a sense of movement in there as well. And then I did a bit of splattering on there too, because I noticed a little bit, just a touch of splattering on there. So I just pop that in, and then I'm using Payne's grey and a bit of blue on the trees there. And again, Michael Morgan has used this effect of adding highlights into the background behind the dark trees to make them stand out as well. So I'm just layering. This is the fun bit really, I think, is when you start to layer lots of colours on top of each other, and you get, particularly if the colours are transparent, you get those colours blending into each other, and you get bits of the other colours underneath kind of appearing underneath there as well. So this bit for me is a lot of fun. You end up with these nice rich combinations of colour on there too. So at this stage I decided that it was time to do what I said I was going to do, which is to add in some of the collage papers, a bit like we've done before. So I've got some tissue paper, and for the fields I'm using this wallpaper that has this liney texture or bumps on it, which is really, it turns out to be very effective for creating the texture that I want. I add a bit of tissue just on the edges of those bits as well, so that the texture doesn't look too obvious or jagged, and I can soften it down a little bit by putting some more texture over the top with the tissue paper. So it's starting to come together at this stage, and turned out to be quite a lot of fun to do. Michael Morgan's work is a lot of fun to work with, because there is so much going on in there, but the whole picture has a wonderful unity in it as well. So now we're getting on with the bottom half of the picture. So I start straight off really adding kind of some greys into this, some greys actually that I've got a little bit of brown mixed into, so I put those directly on top of the textured paper that you saw me put just a few minutes ago, or the evening before. And I wanted to sort of really bring out some of the highlighted areas on the side of this hill excuse me, that Michael had been drawing. You can see I've blended out again still with my fingers. Here we go. Here's this browny sort of grey colour that I'm applying over the top. I suppose you'd say it's more of a brown actually. And then I put the lines in. On this bit I do actually paint the lines directly down on the paper, but you'll see me use the side of a flat brush on the other side in a short while as well. So again, I'm applying multiple layers, so I'm not being overly precious about the colours that I use on here, just as long as it's quite close to what I'm after. That's the main thing, because I can always apply another layer to alter that colour. So you can afford to have a little bit of freedom in the way that you approach using acrylics if you're prepared to paint back over areas. So you can see me just changing colours quite a lot and blending the colours together, still using my fingers to do that. And I keep referring back to the painting, looking at where the patches or layers and blends of colours are appearing, so that I can cover this area with these lovely colours that Michael Morgan has used. My painting ends up being a little bit lighter than the one you can see on screen here, purely because the printout that I was referring to whilst working on this was a little bit lighter, which I don't mind particularly. So here you can see me working around the edges of the fields. I'm still putting on plenty of layers of colour on here. So there's more of a yellowy brown in there, but I'm mixing in greys. Greys are actually a beautiful way of bringing out a lot of the other colours in a picture. It kind of softens things, makes it look more fine and beautiful in my opinion. And then there was actually another little house down the bottom part of the picture, which I'll start working on here. So again, like I did with the village at the top, what I'm doing is working into the background to begin with to show the shape of the building, and then adding in the highlighted or white areas of the building, and then we've got some detail going in, windows again, and there was a few different marks around the background there. Again, the interesting thing here is when I use my fingers to do the blending, the darker the darker or the raised parts of the wrinkly bits on the paper actually pick up the paint, and you get this lovely texture coming through. Those wrinkly bits, you can see them there on the right, and perhaps near the building I've just painted on the left. Shortly I start to play around a little bit more with colour pencils. Colour pencils work beautifully over the top of acrylics, and you can do really fine work with the pencils, or you can do work that brings out, exaggerates the colour a bit more, because the colour will sit perfectly on top of the painted areas, or you can add scratchy finer marks, scribbles into the picture as well. So here I go with the pencil, adding these little bushes towards the back. And I do, once I put that in, I realised I wanted it to be a bit darker, and I haven't got much of a darker pencil, and I want it to stand out and be dark. So I paint in the rest of the trees here with my paint, with my Payne's grey and a bit of blue again. So at the moment the trees aren't standing out too well, and you'll notice that on his painting Michael uses highlights to draw attention to the details that he's interested in or he wants the viewer to see. So he's painted in highlights around all of the trees, and you can see some of the branches now stand out against the background, which is really a really nice way to sort of bring things out. You can see just there how light my picture is in comparison to the real thing. So I do start to refer a bit more to the one on the screen, but I do at this point start to put in my own kind of ideas. Here was interesting because it wasn't so noticeable in the video, but what I did was I put some candle wax down on the background surface earlier, and I carried on painting and forgot about it. But then when I went to add in some brown pencil on top, it actually, because the wax was underneath, it actually pulled off the paint and got this lovely sort of grainy texture just down the bottom there. So happy accidents, a bit like our Kurt Jackson, I guess, in some senses, but not in all, obviously. And there you saw me with the flat brush adding the lines on the field. So there's a few more lines on there than in the original painting, but that's fine. And you can see me just putting in some strong bits of colour with pencils. I'm using white actually, and use a bit of white paint in there as well. And this is where you can start to force out those extra bits of detail and so forth. So I'm going quite pleased with this. It's a nice exercise, and there's a lot of freedom within a composition like this to play around. There's quite a lot of detail in the mark making and in the layers of colours and so forth. You can see me using a bit of pencil there in the mountain just to refine that a little bit more as well. And in just a second or two, I think I zoom into the picture to finish off and just talk a bit more about what I did. So all in all, a really good exercise. I always get a lot out of copying paintings and things, so I hope you do as well.
Here, I worked very heavily over the top with white, but even though I've done that, some of the blue that I left in the background shows through, you see, so it kind of adds another layer to the colours you're using, but allows you to go really dark, or as you can see in the background there, really light as well, or really dark and then really light on the buildings. So there's a contrast.
Where's your paper, Jamie? Where's your tissue papers?
Tissue paper is down here in this area. Yeah, it shows up the most around here, I suppose, and in this area you can see there's a few folds. If I can get in a bit closer, see the texture a bit more. There you go. Yeah, so you can see the folds of the paper coming through, And over here, this is where I had the wax crayon underneath my layers of paint, but then used a colour pencil and it just took off the paint and I ended up with this grainy texture, which is what you could try out as well. And this bit here, as I was saying earlier on, is my wallpaper that I used, and I did a layer of that sort of grey colour underneath first of all, and then I used the brush and just brushed across with white, and the paint only picks up on the bumpy bits, so you end up with those lines coming through that are originally on the raised wallpaper.
So that's mostly acrylic and watercolour pencil, is it?
Yeah, I've used mostly acrylic, I would say, and then little bits of watercolor pencil to add extra bits of color, but also these little lines. And look, that over here I've used pencil.
Where did you get your tissue paper from?
Well, I've got some because I use it for packaging, but it often comes, you know, in the post and things when you order things. But if I see it, I just keep it, you know.
Do you iron it?
No. In fact, I do quite the opposite.
Have you heard of masa paper? MASA paper.
MSA. Not really. No, I'm not that familiar with it.
I like using that because you can crumple it, or you wet it and crumple it into a ball, and then glue it onto your paper, and it makes like a cobweb.
Oh right. Oh, that's something I'll look up then.
That would be good for this.
Yeah.
I've used it for botanical a lot, but I must ask Jill where she gets it from.
Yeah.
I haven't noticed